I'm sorry. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, this morning we begin a 6-week series called Revival. Now, how many of you, when I say revival, think of Billy Graham? Right? You remember those crusades? Sometimes they were on TV. I can remember sitting in my parents' living room watching. For over 58 years, Billy Graham held 417 revivals. These are just fun facts that you can share at lunch later. 417 revivals in 185 countries. It's estimated he was face-to-face or by satellite with 210 million people, and thousands of people dedicated their lives to Christ because of Billy Graham. Now, revivals can be a funny thing. A few years ago, you may remember that the churches in town got together to have a revival. After the revival was conducted, 3 of the pastors stood around discussing their results. The Methodist minister, he said, wow, this revival worked out great. We gained 4 new families. And the Baptist preacher, he said, well, we had an even better response. We gained 6 new families. The Calvary Chapel pastor said, well, we did even better than that. We got rid of our 10 biggest troublemakers. That didn't really happen. Now, revival is not about swapping parishioners, right? The word revival, in fact, means an act or instant of reviving, of gaining new attention or interest to something, or a period of renewed religious interest, or in the case of Billy Graham's crusades, a highly emotional evangelistic, I'll get it right, evangelistic meeting, which certainly his crusades were. Well, I want us to imagine having our own personal revival, what that might look like for us, for our church, our community, and the world around us. Today, much like 200 years ago, I believe we are ripe for renewal, for revival, but we must be open to the opportunities as they are presented to us. Now, each of us, we each participate in our own spiritual journey. At times, our spiritual vitality or passion wanes, and this is true of all parts of our life. In marriage, we slowly find that the fire diminishes if we aren't intentional in the revival of our love lives. This happens in friendships. It happens in jobs. Of course, we call it burnout. In every part of our lives, we need revival from time to time. And in our spiritual lives, we have seasons where we are blooming and bearing fruit and our vitality is high. But when we neglect our spiritual lives, we begin to wilt. And when we have prolonged periods of inattention to our spiritual life, our faith can go dormant. Now, we may go through the motions of Christian life, but the vitality is gone. Now, I believe the seeds of revival and the revival of Christianity today are found in the story of our beginning. And to speak of revival really requires us to go back to our own church's history, back to our founder, John Wesley. Now, Wesley led a period of intense revival in England in the mid to late 1700s, and that resulted in the denomination that we know today. And it is my prayer that this series will help us so that by reclaiming the faith, heart, and practices of John Wesley and the early Methodists, that we can discover the very best parts of our hearts and churches, and in doing so, we might spark a revival in Christianity of our own. In our scripture this morning, we might think that because it comes from the book of Revelation, it's a story about the end times. Am I right, anyone?
Yep.
Well, that's not how or why it was written, but we think it is. Revelation Revelation was written near the end of the first century to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, which is where modern-day Turkey is. And these churches had been dynamic centers of Christianity, each one of them. Ephesus, along with some other churches of Revelation, had lost their vitality, and Christ, speaking to the author of Revelation, noted that the believers in Laodicea had become lukewarm, right? Neither hot nor cold, just... And the Christians of Ephesus, in fact, had lost their first love. Now these Christians, they were busy people, but their activities had not produced the spiritual vitality. In Revelation, the Lord told them the key to their spiritual revival was to do the works that they did at first. Now this is not a new story, is it? We can see this theme throughout the Old Testament. We can see it in our own lives today. Times that we have fallen away and where our own faith becomes lukewarm. In the early 18th century, there was a time when spiritual vitality was ebbing away in many parts of the Church of England. And as a young man at Oxford, John Wesley could feel it, not only in the church and in the university, but in his own soul as well. He felt dissatisfied and believed there had to be something more, something that he longed for but hadn't yet been able to find. The culture at the time of John Wesley was ripe. From the previous 200 years, Europe had been in the midst of religious turmoil. The Protestant Reformation, of course, had created a huge upheaval in the Christian faith as large numbers of people left the Catholic tradition and dedicated themselves to this new Protestantism. The waning of religious sentiment and the rise of the Enlightenment philosophies provided a perfect seedbed for the 18th century revival in which Wesley would play a prominent part. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead in the story because really the story of John Wesley begins with his mother, Susanna. Susanna Wesley was married to John's father, Samuel, who was a pastor at St. Andrew's Church in Epworth. They were parents to 19 children, and this was long before the babysitter, or what are they, you know what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, 9 of the children died in childbirth or early childhood. Much stress. The Wesleys often were in the depths of poverty, and it took great perseverance for Susanna to endure. Her husband was not a particularly popular pastor, and they were the victims of harassment on the part of church members. Right? There was, in fact, and this is awful, a fire in their home when John was just 5 years old. They, in fact, thought that he had perished, and as they were praying for their lost son, they saw him in the window and were able to save him. There was a rumor that, in fact, the fire had been started by disgruntled parishioners. That's awful, don't even, yeah. But at home, Susanna ran a tight ship, and in spite of the challenges she faced, she was intentional about how she structured her family and the tasks that needed to be done. She prioritized the faith formation of her children. She educated her children at home 6 hours a day, and she led family devotions every Sunday evening. She was a wonderful mother to her children. She scheduled time with each child, making sure to meet with each one of them at least 1 hour each week to ask about their faith, their fears, their hopes and dreams, and to inquire about the state of their souls. And this loving activity shaped Wesley's later practice of asking Methodists to meet together each week for an hour in small groups to inquire about one another's progress in their faith. He would wasn't for Susanna Wesley, we would not be here today as United Methodists. When John left home as a young man and went to Oxford for his studies, the values he learned from his mother and his faith traveled with him. His mother, though, was not the only of his parents who influenced him. Both his father and grandfathers were influential in teaching John how to deal with disagreements. His parishioners had help in that also. In many ways, these two generations of Wesley's family reflected the religious conflicts of the time. John's grandfathers on both parents' side were dissenters from the established Anglican Church and had been strongly influenced by the Puritans. His parents, on the other hand, were committed Church of England Anglicans, deeply devoted in the established high church liturgy. John was about as far away theologically of both his parents and in-laws as you could get. And from this intense familial conflict, John adopted a posture that is often called via media, the middle way, that found truth on both sides of the theological divide. Wesley had the keen ability to listen and value people on opposite sides, to find truth, the truth that each possessed, and to chart a middle way, embracing the best of both sides. And in one of his most famous sermons, I know I've quoted this to you recently, Wesley wrote, "Though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike." Wesley was calling those hearers to listen to those whom they disagreed and to focus on what they shared in common. He was teaching them and us to build bridges rather than walls. And this is most important today in our United Methodist Church. We are as divided now as we were then. Of course, we aren't Tories and Whigs or conformists and dissenters or Anglicans and Puritans. But we are Republican and Democrat. We are fundamentalists and progressive. We are liberals and conservatives. Yet divisiveness and conflict drain us of our spiritual vitality and leave many today longing for a different approach. An approach like Wesley's Catholic spirit. So how do we embrace such an approach today? Paul describes it when he admonishes the believers in Philippi, who themselves were divided. We come from a long history of division, by the way. But Paul says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition." This is Philippians 2:3-5. "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourself. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." Having a spirit like Wesley's today means that we assume the best of one another, not the worst. It means we give others the benefit of the doubt. We speak well of others, not poorly. We treat them as we would like to be treated. We listen more and we talk less. We walk in other people's shoes and we try to understand what they believe and why. Now, this doesn't mean we give up our own convictions, but it does mean that we might test them. As a people, we have forgotten how to listen as individuals, as churches, and as a nation. And too easily we find those things that divide us, what makes us different, and then to demonize those who are different than us. The mark of those early Methodists, and a key element of personal and corporate revival in the 21st century, is a willingness to see the good in others, hold our positions with humility, and to treat everyone with respect. It's a willingness to make our hearts pliable in God's hands. It's a willingness to follow the highest calling of Christians, which is both the prerequisite and the goal of revival. And that highest calling, of course, is to love. Finally, Wesley learned perseverance from watching his father stand up to the criticism from his parish. His parents never gave up. In spite of severe opposition and hardship, they knew God's call on their life, and they pressed forward. John Wesley learned from his father that you don't run away, you don't run from your faith, and you don't give up. And we can see these three precursors to revival for John Wesley: his parents, who were instrumental in his faith formation, his teachable spirit that was humble and willing to see the important truths on both sides of the theological divide, and he learned perseverance in the face of opposition. And together they set a perfect stage for a mighty revival. Let us pray. Gracious Lord of the universe, we thank you for Susanna Wesley and her influence on her family. We're thankful that her son John was transformed by your mighty hand and brought about a revival that continues today in the life of our United Methodist Church. Touch our hearts, dear God. Prepare us for revival. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
I would